Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner, for your remarks, and thank you, Judge, and the panelists. In particular, I appreciate Commissioner McDowell's remarks because of my 5 points, he covered 3 of them, so I don't have to do it. But I will just comment on both the constitutional question and both of them in the sense that the rationale for not applying First Amendment and Fifth Amendment protections is a rationale of scarcity. And one of the things that we don't have in the information service providers is scarcity. You've got a relatively easy ability to enter into that marketplace and expand it. You've got people spending $70 billion a year to do that. And that then leads me to the point I do want to make, which is one of the things that this whole debate reminds me of is the unbundling policies that were brought in the 1990s. After Congress, we tried to deregulate telecommunications. And Gigi's comments that she'd like to see things move over to Title II reminded me of that all the more. And essentially there you had the FCC trying to use its regulatory powers to force the major carriers of phone service to allow new upstart competitors to use their infrastructure to provide that service. The analogy is the ISPs will be forced to allow content providers to use their physical infrastructure in order to bring what's really at stake here is television programming that is a few years away to the American families. And so you've got a question of whether, in fact, Gigi mentioned, is it a net zero sum game or is there a win-win situation? The real question here is, do you want an environment in which that negotiation between the content providers and the physical delivery system, the ISPs, is regulated or unregulated? And if it's regulated, the public choice theory tells us that you then have 2 avenues for each side to gain an advantage in the negotiations. In an unregulated marketplace, each of them have to negotiate. They have their economic positions from which they negotiate. They need each other, and they eventually reach a price at which the service providers provide the content providers access to the ultimate customer. And by the way, don't really buy the fact that there's a termination monopoly. Anybody who has Verizon Fios at home and AT&T iPhone can get to the internet through 2 different means. And increasingly families today in this country do that. So if the ultimate customer is an individual, and then they've got the internet at work, which in theory you're supposed to use for work, but in practice gets used for all sorts of purposes. So there's lots of ability for people to hook into that internet in their lives. But you've got this negotiation going on, and what net neutrality does is shift some of the bargaining power from the internet service providers to the content providers. And you ask themselves, why do they feel they need that? The Coase theorem says, you know, they'll negotiate, and it doesn't matter which side you assign the right to, the least cost provider will end up carrying out the obligation, and they'll reach a price. You know, they want it because the price will be less. That's one reason. But there's also a desire to recreate that scarcity that has gone away because of the ubiquity of information service providers. Because when you have that scarcity, you get back to the content provider model that they're used to in Hollywood, where the scarcity is at the delivery end, and they have, therefore, an ability to exact monopoly rents for the content, the television shows and the movies they produce. In the absence of that scarcity, you've got so many delivery mechanisms that you don't have an opportunity to create that monopoly power, and the rents are driven down, and the consumer ultimately wins in that. So that's what's really at stake. Which side will get an additional leverage in bargaining with the other, And do we want to create a system where that bargaining goes on in the presence of politically determined regulations, and the opportunity, therefore, for one side to create a situation of scarcity and increase the opportunity for monopoly rents? Public choice theory tells us that individuals in the presence of that type of government regulation will spend roughly up to the amount of those economic rents on lobbying and hiring lawyers. So all of us as a profession may have an interest in the outcome of that. But the problem is that that money, instead of being used as consumer surplus, benefit for the individuals to have greater access to entertainment, is absorbed into the political process. And when you start having a government body regulating not only the policies and the economic terms, which you had in unbundling, but also the physical regulation of packets and other items, as somebody pointed out, in the absence of a lot of engineering expertise, then you create a situation that is rife with opportunities for political actors to be advocates for different constituencies. And that's, I appreciate you mentioning some of my background, but I spent years working for Dan Quayle analyzing regulations, and you would think that typically business would come in and say regulations are bad. And we heard a lot of people saying that to us, but you also had a lot of business coming in and saying, we actually kind of like this regulation. I had one of my constituents in Indiana tell me that about a regulation of faucets, that they liked the way EPA was regulating it because they were the only company that had that certain type of faucet. And so if the regulation went into effect, they've got an additional market monopoly. They refused to support my campaigns when I told them I wasn't going to support their regulation. And so you've got that choice in the decision of how you want to proceed at net neutrality. And frankly, I think that's the fundamental choice. Do you want to create an environment where the negotiation between those major players on service provider and content provider have to negotiate with each other, or do you want there to be a government overlay and therefore subject the entire process to the politicalization in the sense of each side trying to gain economic advantage by layering on additional regulatory oversight? My choice would be to keep it free and unregulated because you don't have that scarcity. Thank you.